Welcome to Bedtime Express, your peaceful journey into the world of restful storytelling. Tonight, we're taking you on a gentle 3-hour adventure of medieval times. This soothing narrative will guide you through the beautiful process of medieval castle building, from the first dreamer standing on a hilltop to the final stones placed in magnificent towers that touch the clouds. You'll drift peacefully through chapters about choosing the perfect location, the careful art of raising stone walls, creating towers that reach toward the heavens, transforming cold stone into warm castle homes, and the gentle art of castle defense. Each moment is crafted to help you relax as you follow master craftsmen, wise lords, and skilled builders creating something magnificent and lasting. Before you fall asleep, please give this video a like, share your location and time in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Bedtime Express for more soothing bedtime stories designed especially for grown-ups. Now, find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let your mind drift back through the mists of time. Allow yourself to relax completely as we begin this gentle tale of dreams made real in stone and mortar. Bedtime Express is ready for departure. Our next stop is the medieval castles. Have sweet dreams. Tale of Stones and Dreams: How Medieval Castles Were Constructed and Defended. Close your eyes, dear listener, and let your mind drift back through the mists of time, back to an age when the world moved more slowly, when the rhythm of life followed the rising and setting of the sun. In those distant days, nearly 1,000 years ago, across the rolling hills and gentle valleys of medieval Europe, something magical was beginning to happen. Lords and ladies, kings and queens, were dreaming dreams made of stone and mortar, dreams that would rise from the earth like gentle giants watching over the land. These dreams had a name, whispered softly in the evening air: castles. But before the first stone was ever laid, before the first tower reached toward the stars, there was always a dreamer, standing on a hilltop, looking out across the countryside with wonder in their eyes. Perhaps it was a Norman lord, having crossed the Channel from France, seeking a new home in a new land. Or maybe it was a Saxon thane, realizing that the old ways were changing, that wooden halls could no longer provide the safety his people needed. The choosing of a place for a castle was like choosing the perfect spot for a garden, only this garden would grow towers instead of flowers. Our medieval dreamers would walk the land slowly, feeling the earth beneath their feet, listening to the wind as it whispered through the trees. They looked for high places, gentle hills that rose like sleeping giants from the surrounding countryside, places where they could see far in every direction, where approaching friends could be welcomed from afar, and where danger, if it came, could be spotted while it was still just a distant cloud of dust on the horizon. The Lord would often spend months searching for the perfect location, traveling from hill to hill with his trusted advisors, examining each potential site with the careful attention of a jeweler selecting precious stones. They would consider not just the immediate advantages of height and visibility, but the long-term implications of building in each location. Would the soil be stable enough to support massive stone structures? Would the prevailing winds carry smoke away from the living quarters? or would they blow it back into the courtyards? How far would servants have to travel to reach fresh water, and would that distance make the castle vulnerable during a siege? Sometimes the perfect sight would reveal itself gradually, like a secret being slowly unveiled. The Lord might visit a hill several times in different seasons, watching how the light fell across its slopes at various times of day, observing how water flowed around its base during spring rains, noting which directions offered the best views and the greatest natural protection. Local shepherds and farmers would be questioned carefully about the history of each potential location. Had there ever been landslides or floods? Were there springs that never failed even in the driest summers? Did any of the old people remember stories about previous attempts to build on that particular spot? The wisdom of choosing the right location could not be overstated, for a castle built in the wrong place might be beautiful and strong, yet still fail in its essential purpose. History was full of cautionary tales about magnificent fortresses that had been abandoned because their builders had chosen poorly. Castles built too close to marshes that bred disease, or too far from reliable water sources, or in valleys that could be overlooked by enemy positions on higher ground. The wise lord knew that a perfect location was worth more than all the gold in his treasury, for it was the foundation upon which all future success would rest. Water was as precious as gold in those days, perhaps more so. A good castle needed to be near a river or a spring, where the sweet, clear water could flow even during the longest siege. The wisest castle builders would sometimes divert entire streams, guiding the water around their chosen spot like a liquid necklace, creating what we call a moat, not always filled with water, but always providing another gentle barrier between the castle and the outside world. The search for water often led to the discovery of hidden underground streams and springs, sources that bubbled up from deep within the earth with water so pure and cold that it seemed touched by magic. The Lord and his advisors would taste water from every source they found, for they knew that the flavor and quality of water could vary dramatically from one spring to another. Some water tasted sweet and fresh, perfect for drinking and cooking. Other sources might be suitable only for washing or for filling moats, their mineral content too strong for daily consumption. The very best locations had multiple water sources, ensuring that even if one failed or became contaminated, others would remain available. The soil itself told stories to those who knew how to read them. A handful of earth could reveal whether the ground would support the enormous weight of stone walls, whether it would drain properly during wet seasons, whether it contained the clay that would be needed for making bricks and tiles. The Lord's advisors included men who could read these earthen stories like scribes reading illuminated manuscripts, understanding the hidden messages written in layers of soil and rock. Rock formations were examined with particular care, for the presence of good building stone nearby could save enormous amounts of time and money. A hill that contained its own quarry was like a treasure chest waiting to be opened, promising that the castle could be built from stone that had already proven its ability to withstand the local climate. The ideal location might have limestone for the walls, sandstone for decorative work, and slate for roofing tiles, all within a comfortable distance of the building site. The forests surrounding potential castle sites were evaluated with the eye of master carpenters, for a castle required enormous quantities of timber for scaffolding, interior construction, and ongoing maintenance. Oak trees were particularly prized for their strength and durability, but other woods had their places too. Pine for everyday construction, ash for tool handles, willow for basketry and temporary structures. A wise lord would ensure that his chosen location had access to forests that could provide for the castle's needs for generations to come. Understanding that trees grew slowly and that careful forest management would be essential for long-term prosperity. The local population was another crucial consideration in choosing a castle site. A fortress needed not just builders but ongoing inhabitants, farmers to provide food, craftsmen to maintain and improve the structure, soldiers to man the defenses, and servants to handle the countless daily tasks that kept a medieval household functioning. The lord would spend time in nearby villages and towns, talking with local leaders, assessing the skills and attitudes of potential subjects, and determining whether the population was large enough and diverse enough to support a major castle. Trade routes were mapped and studied. For a castle that sat astride important roads or near busy river crossings could generate substantial income from tolls and taxes, while also ensuring a steady flow of news and goods. The lord's advisors would trace the paths that merchants followed as they carried goods from market to market, noting where these routes converged or where they passed through natural bottlenecks that could be controlled from a well-positioned fortress. A castle that commanded important trade routes could largely pay for itself through customs duties and protection fees, while also staying connected to the wider world through the constant flow of travelers. Climate patterns were observed and recorded, for the lord needed to understand how weather would affect both the construction process and the daily life of the completed castle. Which directions did the worst storms typically come from, and how could the castle be oriented to minimize their impact? Where did snow tend to accumulate, and how might this affect access roads during winter months? How often did flooding occur in the surrounding valleys, and how high did the water typically rise? All of these questions had to be answered before construction could begin, for a castle built without regard to local weather patterns might prove uncomfortable or even dangerous to inhabit. Imagine, if you will, the first meeting between the lord who dreamed and the master mason who would make that dream real. They would meet in a warm hall, perhaps with a fire crackling softly in the hearth, scrolls of parchment spread across a wooden table. The mason, his hands rough from years of working with stone, would listen carefully as the lord described his vision. "I see walls that rise like the shoulders of sleeping giants," the lord might say, "and towers that watch over my people like kindly guardians, strong enough to keep harm away, but beautiful enough to make visitors smile with wonder." The master mason, wise in the ways of stone and mortar, would nod slowly, his experienced eye already beginning to translate the lord's poetic vision into practical realities. In his mind, he could already see the castle taking shape, could feel the weight of each stone, could hear the gentle rhythm of hammers shaping the future. "My lord," he would say in his careful way, "we shall build your dream, stone by gentle stone, until it stands proud and peaceful against the sky." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, his practical mind was already calculating the challenges that lay ahead. The master mason would have brought with him examples of his previous work, small stone carvings that demonstrated his skill, drawings on parchment that showed the elegant solutions he had devised for other lords' challenges, and most importantly, the testimony of other nobles who had employed his services. His reputation was his most precious possession, for in an age when few people could read or write, a craftsman's skill was known primarily through word of mouth and the evidence of his completed works. And so the planning would begin. Long conversations that stretched late into the night, with candles flickering softly as Lord and Mason discussed every detail. Where would the great hall stand, warm and welcoming for feasts and celebrations? How high should the walls rise, tall enough to keep danger out, but not so tall as to block out the gentle morning sun? Which way should the main gate face, to welcome the sunrise each day, or to catch the last golden rays of evening? These initial planning sessions were like a delicate dance between dream and reality, as the Lord's vision was gradually shaped and refined by the mason's practical knowledge. Every castle needed certain basic elements: strong walls, secure gates, comfortable living spaces, adequate storage. But the specific arrangement and details of these elements could vary tremendously depending on the Lord's preferences, the nature of the site, and the resources available for construction. The master mason would sketch rough layouts on pieces of bark or smooth boards, using charcoal to draw the basic outline of walls and towers, erasing and redrawing as the discussion evolved. These early sketches were not detailed architectural plans, but rather visual aids that helped both men understand how the castle might look and function. Sometimes the Lord would take the charcoal himself, adding a tower here or suggesting a different arrangement there, as the castle slowly evolved from a vague dream into a concrete plan. The question of size was always delicate, for every lord wanted his castle to be impressive, but practical constraints of time, money, and available labor meant that compromises would have to be made. The master mason would gently guide his client toward realistic expectations, explaining how a smaller, well-built castle would serve better than a larger one that could never be properly completed. "My lord," he might say, "a castle is like a favorite cloak. Better to have one that fits perfectly and keeps you warm than one that is magnificent but too large to be comfortable." These conversations were never hurried, for everyone understood that a castle was not built in a season, or even in a single year. A truly great castle might take a decade or more to complete, growing slowly and steadily like an ancient oak tree, each year adding new rings of strength and beauty. The wise builders knew that patience was as important as stone, that careful planning now would save years of work later. The Lord would share his family history and future aspirations, for these personal elements would influence every aspect of the castle's design. Did the family have particular heraldic symbols that should be incorporated into the stonework? Were there traditional enemy families whose likely methods of attack should be considered in planning the defenses? How many children did the Lord hope to have, and how would their needs affect the layout of the private apartments? All of these personal details mattered, for a castle was not just a military fortress but a family home that needed to serve its inhabitants' needs for generations to come. Religious considerations also played an important role in castle planning, for every fortress needed a chapel where the inhabitants could worship safely even during a siege. The master mason would discuss the proper orientation for the chapel altar, the size of the space needed for the Lord's family and their retainers, and the placement of the chapel within the overall castle layout. Some lords preferred to have their chapel in the main keep, close to their own apartments, while others favored a separate chapel building that could serve the entire castle community. As autumn turned to winter in that first year of planning, the lord and his master mason would often walk together to the chosen site, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air as they discussed their shared vision. Sometimes they would bring other craftsmen with them, carpenters who understood the language of wood, smiths who could coax iron into any shape needed, quarrymen who knew which stones would stand strong for centuries. Each craftsman added his voice to the conversation, like musicians tuning their instruments before a great symphony. These winter visits to the building site served multiple purposes beyond simple planning. The master mason needed to understand how the location looked and felt in different seasons, how the winter light fell across the slopes, where snow tended to accumulate and where it melted first. The Lord, too, needed to develop an intimate familiarity with his chosen ground, learning to see it not just as it was, but as it would become when transformed by human hands and dreams. During these cold weather expeditions, the master mason would often bring along his most trusted apprentices, young men who would play crucial roles in the construction process. These apprentices would listen carefully to the discussions, learning not just the technical aspects of castle building, but the subtle art of managing relationships between craftsmen, clients, and the countless other people who would be involved in the great work. The master mason understood that he was not just building a castle, but training the next generation of builders who would carry on the tradition of turning dreams into stone. The first drawings were made with charcoal on smooth pieces of wood, simple sketches that captured the essence of the dream. Later, as the vision became clearer, these would be transferred to precious parchment, with careful measurements and detailed notes written in the margins in the master mason's careful script. Every line had meaning. Every curve told a story of how people would live and work within these walls. The parchment plans became treasured documents, rolled up carefully and stored in wooden tubes, protected from moisture and damage like the precious records they truly were. But perhaps the most important planning happened not on parchment, but in the heart. For a castle was never just a building. It was a home, a community, a place where families would grow and thrive for generations to come. The Lord would imagine children playing safely in the courtyard, imagine feast days when the great hall would ring with laughter and song, imagine quiet evenings when he and his lady would walk along the battlements, watching the stars emerge in the peaceful sky. The master mason, too, would envision the completed castle, but his dreams were filled with technical details, the perfect curve of an arch, the precise angle of a roof, the smooth operation of gates and drawbridges. He would imagine the satisfaction of seeing every stone in its proper place, every joint perfectly fitted, every measurement exactly as planned. His dreams were filled with the music of construction, the ring of hammers on chisels, the creak of ropes and pulleys, the calls of workers coordinating their efforts. And in those quiet planning moments, something beautiful began to happen. The castle stopped being just an idea, just lines on parchment or words spoken by a warm fire. It began to feel real, to take on a life of its own in the minds of all who would help create it. Soon, very soon, the dream would begin its transformation into stone and mortar, into something that would stand proud and peaceful for centuries to come. As winter deepened and snow began to dust the chosen hilltop like powdered sugar, the final preparations were made. Messages were sent out across the countryside, gentle invitations to craftsmen and workers, promises of good wages and steady work for years to come. Contracts were negotiated with quarries, agreements reached with forests for the timber that would be needed, arrangements made with mills for the grinding of grain that would feed the workers. Everything was falling into place, like pieces of a vast, patient puzzle. The Lord would sometimes stand alone on his chosen hilltop, wrapped in a warm cloak against the winter wind, and try to imagine how the view would change when his dream became real. Where now there was only grass and scattered rocks, soon there would be walls and towers, gates and gardens. Where now the wind blew unimpeded across the hill, soon it would whistle softly through arrow slits and around carefully designed corners. The transformation would be gradual but complete, turning an empty hill into a thriving center of life and activity. But even in these moments of solitary dreaming, the Lord was not truly alone, for already, in villages and towns across the countryside, people were preparing to join in the great work. Stonemasons were sharpening their tools and checking their levels, carpenters were selecting the finest timbers, and countless laborers were making ready to lend their strong backs to the task of turning dreams into reality. The castle existed already in the hearts and minds of all who would help create it, waiting only for spring to begin its physical manifestation. And as the first hints of spring began to show themselves in the longer days and the gradual warming of the earth, everyone involved in the great project could feel it in their bones. Soon, very soon, the real work would begin. Soon the hilltop would ring with the sounds of construction, the gentle percussion of hammers on stone, the creak of ropes and pulleys, the soft conversations of craftsmen sharing their ancient knowledge. Soon the dream would begin its slow, patient transformation into something magnificent and lasting. But for now, in these last quiet moments before the building began, there was a special kind of peace on the hilltop. It was the peace of potential, of dreams waiting to unfold, of a future that stretched out golden and full of possibility. The castle existed already, in a way, not yet in stone, but in the hearts and minds of all who would help create it. And that, perhaps, was the most magical part of all. When the first warm days of spring finally arrived, they brought with them a quiet excitement that seemed to dance on the morning breeze. The long months of planning were drawing to a close, and the hilltop that had stood empty through the winter was about to become the busiest place in the entire countryside. Our master mason stood once again on the chosen ground, but this time he was not alone. Around him gathered the finest craftsmen from miles around, each carrying the tools of his trade, each ready to lend his skill to the great work that was about to begin. The arrival of the workers was like the gathering of a great extended family, for many of these men had worked together on previous projects and knew each other's strengths and preferences. There were grizzled veterans who had helped build some of the finest castles in the land, and eager young apprentices experiencing their first major construction project. There were specialists whose skills were so rare and valuable that they traveled from site to site across the entire kingdom, and local craftsmen who brought intimate knowledge of regional materials and techniques. The master mason greeted each arrival personally, for he understood that the success of the entire project depended not just on individual skills, but on how well all these diverse talents could be coordinated into a single, unified effort. He would assign living quarters in the temporary buildings that had been constructed over the winter, making sure that craftsmen with complementary skills were housed near each other to encourage collaboration and mutual learning. The dormitories buzzed with conversation as old friends renewed acquaintances and new workers were welcomed into the close-knit community of castle builders. The first task was always the same, whether building a humble cottage or a mighty castle. The foundation had to be prepared, but where a cottage might need only a shallow trench filled with field stones, a castle required something far more substantial. Something that would support not just walls, but towers that would reach toward the clouds themselves. The master mason directed his men to begin digging, their shovels cutting through the soft earth with a rhythm as gentle and persistent as a heartbeat. The excavation work was organized with military precision, for the master mason knew that a good foundation was the cornerstone of everything that would follow. Teams of diggers worked in carefully planned shifts, with fresh men rotating in as others rested, ensuring that the work proceeded steadily without exhausting any individual worker. The earth that was removed was not simply discarded, but carefully sorted and stockpiled for future use. Good topsoil for gardens, clay for making bricks and tiles, gravel for roadways and drainage systems. As they dug deeper, the workers discovered the secret history of the hill, written in layers of soil and stone. Here was clay that had been laid down when ancient rivers flowed across this land. There were stones carried by glaciers in the distant past, and sometimes, if they were lucky, they would find bedrock, the solid bone of the earth itself, perfect for anchoring their great work. The master mason would examine each layer carefully, running the soil through his fingers like a farmer testing seed grain, tapping stones with his hammer to hear their secret songs of strength and stability. The discovery of unexpected underground features sometimes required changes to the original plans. A hidden spring might be diverted to create a well within the castle walls, or an outcropping of particularly fine stone might suggest a slight adjustment in the placement of a tower to take advantage of this natural resource. The master mason approached these discoveries not as obstacles, but as gifts from the earth itself, opportunities to make the castle even better than originally planned. A castle must have roots deeper than the mightiest oak. The old mason would tell his apprentices as they worked, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent coaxing magnificent structures from stubborn earth. For just as a tree draws its strength from the earth below, so too must our walls find their power in a foundation that will never shift or fail. And so they dug, day after day, until they had created a series of trenches that outlined the entire castle, like a giant's drawing traced in the earth, each line precisely measured and perfectly positioned. The foundation trenches were not simple rectangular ditches, but complex excavations that took into account the specific requirements of each section of the castle. Where the great keep would stand, the foundation might descend 20 feet or more into the earth, creating a massive base that could support the enormous weight of the central tower. Where the curtain walls would run, the trenches were somewhat shallower but still substantial, providing a secure base for walls that would rise 40 feet or more above the ground. While some workers dug, others were busy preparing the materials that would bring the castle to life. In quarries scattered across the countryside, Skilled stoneworkers were carefully extracting the limestone and sandstone that would form the castle's bones. These quarrymen knew their craft like musicians know their favorite songs. They could read the grain of the stone like a scholar reading Latin, could tell at a glance which rocks would split cleanly and which would crumble, could sense where the perfect building blocks lay hidden within the living rock. The quarrying process was an art form in itself, requiring patience, skill, and an intimate understanding of stone. The quarrymen would study a rock face for days before making the first cut, looking for natural fracture lines and grain patterns that would allow them to extract the maximum amount of usable stone with the minimum amount of waste. They used wooden wedges soaked in water, which would expand as they absorbed moisture, gradually splitting the stone along predetermined lines with irresistible but gentle pressure. Each stone was examined and tested with the care of a jeweler evaluating precious gems. The quarrymen would strike blocks gently with their hammers, listening for the clear bell-like ring that indicated good solid stone without hidden cracks or weaknesses. Stones that produced a dull thud when struck were rejected, for they contained flaws that might cause them to fail under the enormous stresses they would face in the castle walls. The stones were not hewn hastily, but with careful deliberation and ancient skill that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen. Each block was examined and tested, struck gently with a hammer to hear the clear ring that indicated good, solid stone, free from hidden cracks or weaknesses. The quarrymen would mark each stone with simple symbols carved into their surfaces, a cross for the finest quality blocks that would form the outer walls, a circle for stones suitable for interior work, a line for those that would be ground down into mortar or used for fill. The most prized stones were those destined to become cornerstones and foundation blocks, massive pieces that might weigh as much as a full-grown ox and require teams of men to move. These giants were shaped with extraordinary precision, their surfaces dressed smooth and their edges cut perfectly square, for any imperfection in these crucial stones would be magnified throughout the entire structure built upon them. The master quarrymen who created these foundation stones were among the most respected craftsmen of their time, for they held the future stability of the entire castle in their skilled hands. Meanwhile, other craftsmen were preparing the mortar that would bind the stones together through the centuries, creating joints stronger than the stones themselves. This was no simple task, for medieval mortar was a carefully guarded secret, a recipe passed down from master to apprentice through generations of builders who understood that the strength of their mortar often determined whether their buildings would stand for decades or centuries. Lime was burned in great kilns, massive stone furnaces that glowed like dragons' mouths in the darkness, consuming enormous quantities of wood to transform limestone into the white powder that formed the base of all good mortar. The lime burning process required constant attention and precise temperature control, for lime burned too quickly would be weak and crumbly, while lime burned too slowly might not achieve the chemical transformation that gave it its binding properties. The lime burners were specialists in their own right, men who could judge the temperature of their kilns by the color of the flames and the sound of the burning fuel, who knew exactly when to add more limestone and when to bank the fires to maintain perfect conditions. Sand was selected grain by grain, or so it seemed to casual observers watching the mortar makers at work. In reality, The sand was tested and sorted with scientific precision, for only the finest and purest grains would create mortar strong enough to hold a castle together for centuries. River sand was preferred over sea sand, for the salt in marine sand could cause mortared joints to fail after years of weathering. The ideal sand was angular rather than rounded, providing better mechanical bonding between the individual grains. But the secret ingredient, the one that gave medieval mortar its legendary strength and durability, was often something unexpected and sometimes almost magical in its effects. Some masons swore by ox blood mixed into the lime, claiming that the organic proteins made the mortar more flexible and resistant to cracking. Others preferred egg whites, beaten until they foamed like sea spray, then folded carefully into the mixture to create microscopic air bubbles that would allow the mortar to expand and contract with temperature changes without losing its grip on the stones. Still others added ale or wine to their mortar, believing that the alcohol and the byproducts of fermentation would somehow transfer beneficial properties to the stone mixture. Modern scientists might scoff at such additions, but the medieval builders who used these techniques created structures that have stood strong for nearly 1,000 years, suggesting that their empirical knowledge was more sophisticated than it might first appear. As spring turned toward summer, the first stones began their journey from quarry to castle, an adventure in itself that required careful planning and enormous resources. The great blocks had to be transported across miles of countryside, over rivers and through forests, up hills and down valleys, along roads that were little more than dirt tracks, and across bridges that had never been designed to carry such massive loads. Teams of oxen, patient and strong as the stones they pulled, were hitched to wooden carts, specially constructed for this purpose. Vehicles that groaned under the weight of their precious cargo, but somehow managed to deliver it safely to the building site. The cart drivers sang as they worked, old songs that matched the rhythm of hooves and wheels, melodies that seemed to make the journey pass more quickly and the loads feel lighter. These songs were not mere entertainment, but served practical purposes as well, helping the drivers coordinate their efforts when navigating difficult terrain and providing a way to communicate with their animals over the noise of creaking wheels and jangling harnesses. Some of the largest stones required special transportation methods, massive sleds pulled by dozens of oxen or even teams of horses when speed was more important than economy. The routes these stone caravans followed were carefully planned to avoid the steepest hills and the most treacherous river crossings, even if this meant taking longer paths that added days to the journey. Temporary bridges were sometimes constructed across streams too wide or too deep for the loaded carts to ford safely. On the hilltop, the foundation trenches were gradually filled with carefully fitted stones, each one chosen and placed with the precision of a jeweler, setting precious gems in a royal crown. The master mason would examine every joint, would run his hands along every surface, feeling for imperfections that might weaken the work or create points of stress that could cause problems years or decades in the future. Perfect is not too good for a foundation, he would remind his workers, his voice carrying the authority of experience, for everything that comes after depends upon what we build today. The foundation stones were laid in carefully planned patterns that distributed weight evenly and created interlocking joints that would prevent any individual stone from shifting over time. The largest stones were placed at the corners and at regular intervals along the walls, serving as anchors that would hold the entire structure together. Between these massive anchor stones, smaller blocks were fitted with mathematical precision, creating joints so tight that a knife blade could not be inserted between them. The first walls began to rise as summer settled over the countryside like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it the long days and warm weather that made outdoor construction work pleasant and productive. At first, the walls were hardly more than lines of stone marking where the castle would eventually stand, but gradually, day by day, they gained height and substance, transforming from mere marks on the landscape into substantial barriers that began to define and enclose space. The workers developed a rhythm, a gentle dance of lifting and placing, mixing and smoothing that seemed to flow like water or music through the construction site. Each man knew his role and performed it with quiet competence, whether he was mixing mortar, shaping stones, or manning the ropes and pulleys that lifted materials to wherever they were needed. The sound of productive work filled the air, the ring of hammers on chisels, the scrape of trowels spreading mortar, the calls of workers coordinating their efforts, the creak of wooden scaffolding adjusting to new loads. Each stone was a puzzle piece that had to fit perfectly with its neighbors, and the medieval masons were masters of this ancient art that combined mathematical precision with intuitive understanding of how stone behaved under different conditions. They would examine a block from every angle, turning it this way and that like a scholar studying a precious manuscript, sometimes trimming an edge here or there with careful taps of their chisels, until it settled into its destined place with a satisfying thunk that seemed to resonate through the entire structure. The sound of stone meeting stone, of mortar squelching into place, of wooden handles striking iron tools, created a symphony that echoed across the hilltop from dawn until dusk. The masons developed an almost mystical ability to predict how stones would behave, knowing instinctively which face should be turned upward, which edge should bear the greatest weight, which surface would weather best when exposed to wind and rain. This knowledge came not from books or formal training, but from years of handling stone, of learning to read its grain and color and texture, like a language written in mineral and crystal. A master mason could run his hands over a rough block of limestone and visualize exactly how it would look when properly dressed and fitted into the wall. But building a castle was not all about brute strength and heavy lifting, though both were certainly required in abundance. It demanded enormous skill and mathematical precision, for every wall had to be perfectly vertical, every corner exactly square, every course of stones perfectly level and true. A wall that leaned even slightly would eventually fail under its own weight, while corners that were not perfectly square would create stress points that could crack and crumble over time. The master mason carried with him an array of ingenious tools that would have impressed any modern engineer. Plumb lines made from perfectly weighted stones, suspended on carefully twisted cords, levels constructed from carefully balanced wooden boards, with water-filled channels that revealed the slightest deviation from true horizontal, squares and compasses made from hardened iron that could lay out perfect angles and graceful curves with mathematical precision. These tools were not mere implements but treasured possessions, often passed down from master to apprentice through generations of builders. A master mason's level might be made from a piece of wood taken from a tree that had grown straight and true for 100 years, seasoned and shaped until it was as stable and reliable as the stone walls it helped to create. His plumb line might use a weight that had been carefully cast and balanced, tested against other weights until its accuracy was beyond question. The apprentice masons watched their master with the reverence of students, observing a great teacher, absorbing not just the technical knowledge of their craft, but the deeper wisdom that came from decades of experience. They learned not just how to cut stone and mix mortar, but how to read the subtle signs that told them whether their work was true. The feel of a stone settling into its proper place, the sound of mortar spreading evenly, the way morning light revealed tiny imperfections that had been invisible the evening before. They learned to feel the weight of a stone in their hands and know instinctively where it belonged in the growing wall, to hear in the sound of their hammers whether the mortar beneath was setting properly, to sense when the wind and weather conditions were perfect for laying stone, and when it would be better to wait for a more favorable day. This knowledge could not be taught from books, but had to be absorbed slowly through countless hours of patient practice, under the guidance of masters who had spent their lives perfecting their understanding of stone and mortar. As the walls grew higher, new challenges arose, for now the stones had to be lifted far above the heads of the workers, carried up ramps and platforms that swayed gently in the wind. This called for the construction of elaborate scaffolding systems, wooden frameworks that rose alongside the growing walls like temporary forests of timber and rope, creating a second architecture that was almost as complex as the permanent structure it supported. The carpenters who built these scaffolding systems were artists in their own right, creating stairs and platforms and pulley systems that allowed the work to continue safely even as the walls reached toward the sky. These temporary structures had to be strong enough to support not just the weight of workers and materials, but also the dynamic loads created when heavy stones were lifted and maneuvered into place. The scaffolding also had to be flexible enough to adjust as the permanent structure grew and changed shape, and modular enough that sections could be dismantled and relocated as needed. The most spectacular of these lifting devices was the great wheel crane, a marvel of medieval engineering that looked like a giant's hamster wheel, but performed with the precision of a fine clockwork mechanism. Men would walk inside the wheel, their footsteps turning the massive wooden drum and raising heavy stones high into the air with ropes and pulleys that multiplied their efforts many times over. Children from nearby villages would sometimes gather just to watch this amazing machine at work, their faces bright with wonder as blocks of stone that would take dozens of men to lift seemed to fly upward as if by magic. The crane operators developed a special rhythm and technique that maximized their efficiency while minimizing the risk of accidents. They learned to coordinate their steps so that the wheel turned smoothly and steadily, avoiding the jerky motions that could cause a heavy stone to swing dangerously at the end of its rope. They developed signals and calls that allowed them to communicate with the workers above, ensuring that stones were delivered exactly where they were needed, without delay or confusion. But perhaps the most important ingredient in all this construction was not stone or mortar, not timber or iron, but the careful patience that every craftsman brought to his work. Nothing was rushed, nothing was done carelessly, for everyone understood that they were building not just for today, but for generations yet unborn, for people who were not yet even imagined, but who would someday call this castle their home. A grandson not yet conceived might one day walk these walls. A great-great-granddaughter might look out from these windows at a world not yet imagined. This sense of building for the future influenced every decision, from the selection of materials to the techniques used in construction. The builders chose methods that would require minimal maintenance over the years, preferring approaches that were more labor-intensive initially but would prove more durable in the long run. They planned for the natural settling and weathering that would occur over decades and centuries, building in allowances for these changes so that the structure would remain sound and beautiful even as it aged. The walls themselves were marvels of engineering, though they appeared simple to the casual observer who saw only the smooth stone faces that would eventually be visible from the outside. What looked like solid stone from a distance was actually a carefully designed sandwich. Two parallel walls of carefully fitted ashlar blocks on the outside and inside, with a core of rubble and mortar between them that provided additional strength while using less of the expensive dressed stone. This design was both economical and incredibly strong, creating walls that could withstand almost any assault while making efficient use of available materials and labor. The rubble core was not simply a random collection of stone fragments, but was carefully graded and layered to create maximum strength and stability. Larger stones were placed at the bottom of each course, with progressively smaller material toward the top, creating a structure that naturally shed water and distributed weight evenly. The mortar used in the core was often different from that used for the outer faces, formulated to bond well with irregular surfaces and to flow into small spaces without creating voids or weak spots. As the seasons cycled and the walls continued to climb skyward, something magical began to happen on the hilltop that went beyond mere construction. What had once been an empty hill was transforming into something magnificent, something that had never existed before, but somehow felt as if it had always belonged there, as natural and permanent as the ancient oaks that dotted the surrounding countryside. The castle was beginning to have a personality of its own, a presence that could be felt even by visitors who glimpsed it from miles away. Travelers approaching across the countryside would see the growing walls first as a geometric disturbance on the natural horizon, then gradually as something clearly made by human hands, and finally as an impressive structure that commanded attention and respect. The castle began to change the character of the entire region, serving as a landmark and reference point that people used when giving directions or describing locations. 3 miles past the new castle, travelers would say, or turn left where you can see the tower rising. The workers, too, were changing as they labored together toward their common goal, forming bonds and friendships that would last long after the castle was completed. Men who had arrived as strangers became friends, sharing meals and stories, teaching each other the secrets of their individual crafts, and developing the kind of camaraderie that comes from working together on something truly magnificent. The master mason watched over them all like a kindly father, settling disputes with gentle wisdom, encouraging the discouraged, celebrating small victories as each section of wall was completed to his exacting standards. The daily routine of construction became a kind of ritual, with each day beginning before dawn as the workers gathered around fires to share simple breakfasts and plan the day's activities. The master mason would assign tasks and review progress, checking on work that had been done the day before and planning new challenges that lay ahead. As the sun rose, the workers would spread out across the site, each going to his assigned station with the quiet confidence of men who knew their craft and took pride in their work. By the time the first winter of construction arrived, the lower walls stood strong and proud, their stones already beginning to weather and settle into their new home on the hilltop. The constant exposure to wind and rain had begun to give the fresh-cut stone a more natural appearance, softening harsh edges and blending the man-made structure more harmoniously into the landscape. The workers covered their unfinished sections with straw and hides to protect them from frost damage, and many of the craftsmen returned to their homes for the cold months, carrying with them memories of the great work and promises to return with the spring. But even in the quiet of winter, the castle continued to grow, not in height but in the dreams and plans of those who were creating it. The master mason spent the long evenings by his fire, sketching details for the towers that would rise next year, calculating the curves of arches, planning the intricate stonework that would turn functional walls into works of art. His drawings became more detailed and sophisticated as the months passed, incorporating lessons learned from the first year of construction and new ideas that emerged from quiet contemplation. For he knew, as all great builders know, that a castle is never finished in the hands alone, but must first be completed in the heart and mind of its creator. The physical work of construction was only the visible manifestation of a much deeper process of creative imagination and careful planning. Every stone that would be laid in the coming year existed first as an idea. Every arch that would be constructed was already present in the master mason's mind as a perfect curve waiting to be realized in limestone and mortar. The Lord, too, spent the winter months refining his vision of the completed castle, imagining in ever greater detail how life would unfold within those rising walls. He planned the great feasts that would celebrate the castle's completion, envisioned the daily routines of a functioning fortress household, and dreamed of the generations of his family who would call this magnificent structure their home. In his mind, the empty rooms already rang with laughter and conversation. The cold walls already glowed with the warmth of fires and candlelight. As the second spring of construction dawned across the countryside, painting the hills with fresh green and filling the air with the songs of returning birds, the hilltop castle site awakened from its winter sleep like a garden coming back to life after the long, cold months. The walls that had been left covered and protected through the winter were uncovered to reveal stone that had settled and mellowed, that now seemed to belong to the hill as naturally as the ancient oaks that dotted the landscape. But the most exciting work was yet to begin, for now it was time to raise the towers that would lift the castle's gaze to the very heavens themselves. The master mason had spent the winter months not in idleness, but in careful planning and preparation, his mind constantly working on the complex engineering challenges that lay ahead. Tower construction was perhaps the most challenging aspect of castle building, requiring not just strength and skill, but a deep understanding of how stone and mortar behaved when stacked high into the sky, how wind forces affected tall structures, and how to create buildings that were both beautiful and supremely functional. Each tower would be a marvel of engineering, a graceful balance between strength and beauty, between the practical needs of defense and the aesthetic desires of those who would call the castle home. The return of the workers in spring was like a great reunion of old friends, as craftsmen who had scattered to their homes during the cold months came together once again to continue their shared labor of love. Many brought with them new apprentices, young men eager to learn the ancient arts of stone carving and mortar mixing, so the workforce was larger and more diverse than it had been the previous year. The experienced workers took these newcomers under their wings, teaching them not just the technical skills they would need, but the traditions and customs that made the community of castle builders something special. The first tower to rise was typically the keep, the great central tower that would serve as both the strongest point of defense and the most comfortable living space for the lord and his family. The foundation for this mighty structure had been dug deeper than any other part of the castle, down to the bedrock itself, when possible, for the keep might rise 5, 6, or even 7 stories into the air, creating enormous stresses that had to be transferred safely down into the solid earth below. Looking at the massive foundation stones, each one weighing as much as several oxen and requiring teams of workers to position, visitors could begin to imagine the magnificence that would soon soar above them. The construction of a tower required different techniques and approaches than building simple walls, for as the structure gained height, it also had to gain grace and elegance. The walls could not simply rise straight up like cliffs, or they would appear crude and ungainly, overwhelming the landscape rather than enhancing it. Instead, the master mason planned subtle curves and gentle tapers, so that the tower would seem to flow upward like a great stone tree, wide and solid at the base, becoming more slender and elegant as it reached toward the clouds. The mathematical calculations required for tower construction were extraordinarily complex, involving not just the basic geometry of height and width, but subtle considerations of wind loading, thermal expansion, and the gradual settling that would occur over decades as the massive structure found its equilibrium with the earth beneath it. The master mason worked with instruments of surprising sophistication, measuring rods marked with precise increments, plumb lines weighted with carefully crafted lead bobs, and compass devices that could inscribe perfect circles and arcs in stone or parchment. The process began much as the walls had, with careful laying of foundation courses, each stone fitted perfectly to its neighbors, each joint sealed with the finest mortar that skilled craftsmen could prepare. But as the tower began to rise above ground level, new challenges presented themselves that tested every aspect of the builder's knowledge and experience. The walls had to be thicker at the base, and could gradually become thinner as they climbed, but this transition had to be so gradual as to be almost imperceptible, creating an impression of natural growth rather than obvious human engineering. One of the most crucial elements in tower construction was the creation of the spiral staircase that would wind its way up through the heart of the structure like a stone ribbon connecting earth to sky. This staircase, carved from solid stone blocks with techniques that bordered on sculpture, was both a practical necessity and a work of art that would be admired by inhabitants and visitors for centuries to come. Each step had to be precisely calculated, rising at just the right angle to make climbing comfortable, even for elderly residents or guests carrying heavy burdens, yet steep enough to conserve precious space within the tower's interior. The curve of the spiral had to be gentle enough to navigate safely, yet tight enough to fit within the available space, and the entire staircase had to be perfectly integrated with the tower's defensive strategy. Medieval staircases always spiraled clockwise as one ascended, a design choice that gave defending swordsmen, who were usually right-handed, a significant advantage over attacking swordsmen, whose sword arms would be restricted by the central column of the staircase. Every aspect of the design served multiple purposes, combining beauty, functionality, and defensive effectiveness in a single, elegant solution. The stone carvers who created these staircases were among the most skilled craftsmen on the entire building site, artists who could envision a perfect spiral in 3 dimensions and then execute it with mathematical precision using only hand tools and centuries-old techniques. Each step was carved from a single block of stone, shaped not just to provide a level surface for walking, but to fit perfectly with its neighbors above and below, creating a seamless spiral that seemed to flow like frozen water up through the center of the tower. The worn steps of medieval castles that survive today, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, testify to the skill of these ancient craftsmen and the enduring quality of their work. As the towers grew taller, the work became increasingly challenging and potentially dangerous. For every stone, every bucket of mortar, every wooden beam had to be lifted high into the air, using mechanical systems that pushed the limits of medieval engineering. The great wheel cranes groaned and creaked as they hoisted massive blocks to dizzying heights, and the workers who labored on the scaffolding platforms seemed to dance with the clouds themselves, moving with the casual confidence of men who had made peace with heights that would terrify most modern construction workers. Despite the obvious dangers involved in working at such elevations, accidents were surprisingly rare, for the medieval builders understood that haste and carelessness were the enemies of both safety and quality. They developed elaborate safety protocols, using ropes and harnesses to secure workers, creating multiple backup systems for lifting heavy loads, and maintaining their equipment with obsessive attention to detail. The master mason knew that a single serious accident could not only cost a man his life, but could also destroy the morale and confidence of the entire workforce. The walls of the towers were not solid stone throughout, for that would have been both impossibly expensive and structurally unnecessary given the engineering knowledge of the time. Instead, like the lower walls, they were built with thick outer skins of carefully dressed stone and inner skins of similar quality, with the space between filled with smaller stones and mortar mixed to a consistency that would flow into every void and crevice. But within these walls, as the tower rose story by story, the builders created something truly magical, a series of chambers, one above the other, each designed for a specific purpose and fitted out with all the conveniences that medieval engineering could provide. The lowest level of the keep, usually partly below ground level for maximum security, served as the castle's strong room and primary storage area. Here, behind walls of exceptional thickness that might measure 15 feet or more from inner surface to outer surface, the Lord would keep his most precious possessions: chests of gold and silver, important legal documents that established his rights and privileges, family heirlooms that represented generations of history and tradition. The walls at this level were so thick that they created chambers that felt as secure and permanent as caves deep within a mountain, spaces where the most valuable things could be stored with complete confidence in their safety. The security of the strong room was enhanced by ingenious hidden features that casual observers would never suspect. Secret passages allowed trusted servants to enter and exit without using the main door, while hidden compartments built into the thickness of the walls provided additional storage for the most precious items. The floors were often constructed with hidden vaults beneath them, accessible only through concealed trapdoors, that blended seamlessly with the surrounding stonework. Above the storage level came the great hall of the keep, a magnificent chamber that served as the heart of castle life and the center of the Lord's power and hospitality. This room required special engineering considerations, for it needed to be both spacious enough to accommodate large gatherings and beautiful enough to impress visitors with the Lord's wealth and taste. The chamber needed high ceilings that would create a sense of grandeur and large windows that would fill the space with natural light during daytime celebrations and ceremonies. The builders created this open space by using thick stone arches that transferred the enormous weight of the floors above to the outer walls, leaving the center of the room free and airy, while maintaining the structural integrity of the entire tower. These arches were not just functional elements, but were decorated with carved moldings and sculptural details that transformed engineering necessities into works of art. The keystones at the peaks of the arches were often carved with the Lord's heraldic symbols or with religious motifs that reflected the family's piety and values. The windows in the towers were marvels of medieval engineering that combined practical functionality with extraordinary beauty, starting as narrow slits at the lower levels for security and defense, then gradually becoming larger and more elaborate as the tower gained height and the need for defensive precautions decreased. Each window required dozens of precisely carved stones, not just for the opening itself, but for the elaborate surrounds that would channel rainwater away from the interior, provide comfortable seating alcoves where ladies could sit to read or do needlework, and admit the maximum amount of light while maintaining the structural integrity of the wall. The window seats were particular marvels of stone carving, creating comfortable niches within the thickness of the walls where people could sit and enjoy the views while being protected from drafts and weather. These alcoves were often equipped with wooden shutters that could be closed during storms, and some featured small fireplaces or brazier holders that could provide additional warmth during cold weather. The stonework around these windows was often highly decorative, with carved capitals and moldings that turned functional openings into architectural jewels. The upper levels of the keep were designed as private apartments for the Lord's family, chambers that combined comfort with security, luxury with practicality, in ways that would have impressed even modern architects. These rooms featured fireplaces with elaborate chimney systems that had been carefully designed to draw smoke up and out of the tower without weakening the walls or creating fire hazards. The fireplaces themselves were architectural marvels, with carved mantels and decorative surrounds that transformed functional necessities into works of art that proclaimed the family's wealth and sophisticated taste. The chimney systems represented some of the most advanced engineering in the entire castle, for they had to carry smoke and combustion gases safely from multiple fireplaces up through the interior of the tower and out into the open air. The flues were lined with fire-resistant stones and were designed with careful attention to draft patterns that would ensure efficient operation even during storms when wind patterns around the tower became unpredictable. Some of the more elaborate keeps featured interconnected chimney systems that could provide heat to multiple rooms from a single fire, an early form of central heating that demonstrated the sophistication of medieval engineering. At the very top of the keep, the builders created perhaps their greatest masterpiece, the roof and battlements that would crown their work and serve as the castle's ultimate lookout point and final defensive position. The roof itself was a complex structure that had to shed rain and snow efficiently while providing secure platforms for defenders and creating an architectural crown worthy of the magnificent structure below. The famous crenellations, the tooth-like projections along the top of castle walls, were not merely decorative features copied from other buildings, but served important practical purposes that had been refined through generations of military experience. Each merlon, the high portions of the crenellations, and each crenel, the gaps between them, was carefully designed and proportioned according to mathematical principles that balanced defensive effectiveness with architectural beauty. The gaps had to be wide enough to allow archers to shoot through comfortably, but not so wide as to provide easy targets for enemy arrows or siege engines. The solid portions had to be high enough to provide meaningful protection for defenders, but not so high as to obstruct their view of the surrounding countryside or interfere with their ability to operate their weapons effectively. Everything was calculated with the precision of a master mathematician working on a complex geometric proof, yet the final result appeared effortlessly graceful and natural. The proportions of the crenellations were often based on classical mathematical ratios that created pleasing visual harmonies, while their practical dimensions were determined by careful study of human ergonomics and the requirements of medieval weapons and defensive tactics. But the keep was not the only tower to rise toward the heavens during this exciting phase of construction. At strategic points around the castle's perimeter, smaller towers began to sprout like stone flowers blooming in a carefully tended garden, each designed to provide specific defensive capabilities while adding to the overall beauty and impressiveness of the structure. These flanking towers allowed defenders to provide covering fire along the entire length of the walls, ensuring that no enemy could approach the castle without being observed and challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. The positioning of these towers was determined by careful geometric calculations that ensured overlapping fields of fire while avoiding any blind spots where attackers might find shelter. The master mason worked with the castle's military advisors to determine the optimal spacing and design of each tower, taking into account the range and accuracy of medieval weapons, the topography of the surrounding terrain, and the likely approaches that enemies might use in attempting to assault the fortress. Each flanking tower was a complete defensive system in itself, equipped with multiple levels of arrow loops, storage space for weapons and ammunition, and living quarters for the guards who would man its defenses. The towers were connected to the main castle by secure passages that allowed defenders to move quickly from one position to another without exposing themselves to enemy fire. These connecting passages were often built with their own defensive features, including gates and barriers that could be closed to prevent enemies from using captured towers as stepping stones to assault the rest of the castle. The gatehouse tower was perhaps the most complex and challenging of all these structures, for it had to serve multiple functions simultaneously while maintaining the highest possible level of both security and beauty. It had to be strong enough to resist the most determined assault by siege engines and battering rams, beautiful enough to impress visitors and reflect the Lord's status and sophistication, and practical enough to control the daily flow of people and goods in and out of the castle without creating bottlenecks or security risks. The master mason and his team lavished special attention on this structure, knowing that it would be the first thing most people saw when they approached the castle, and that its appearance and functionality would shape visitors' impressions of the entire fortress. The gatehouse incorporated multiple layers of defense, starting with the approaches that channeled visitors along predetermined paths where they could be observed and evaluated. The actual gate structure featured massive wooden doors reinforced with iron bands and studs, hung on hinges so large and heavy that they required teams of men to operate properly. Behind the doors, a secondary barrier called a portcullis could be lowered to seal the entrance completely, while murder holes in the ceiling above allowed defenders to attack anyone who might somehow force their way past the outer defenses. The portcullis mechanism alone was a marvel of medieval engineering, requiring the combined skills of master carpenters, blacksmiths, and stone masons working in perfect coordination. The massive iron gate, with its pointed spikes, designed to penetrate deeply into grooves cut into the stone threshold, had to be balanced and counterweighted so precisely that it could be raised and lowered smoothly by a relatively small crew of operators. The mechanism was housed in a specially designed chamber above the gate passage, accessible only through secure stairs and passages that were themselves defended by additional gates and barriers. The construction of the portcullis chamber required extraordinary precision in stonework, with precisely calculated slots and guides that would allow the heavy iron gate to slide smoothly up and down without binding or jamming. The stone slots had to be perfectly parallel and exactly the right width, while the guides had to be positioned with mathematical accuracy to ensure that the portcullis would seat properly when lowered. The finished mechanism, operated by a great windlass and system of ropes and pulleys, could seal the gateway in moments while providing defenders with multiple layers of protection and multiple fallback positions. As each tower neared completion, it was fitted with a complex system of interconnecting walkways and stairs that allowed defenders to move quickly from one position to another without ever exposing themselves to enemy fire from outside the castle walls. These passages, hidden within the thickness of the walls themselves, were marvels of three-dimensional planning that required the master mason to envision the entire castle as a single, integrated defensive system. The passages wound through the structure like the corridors of a vast underground palace, connecting towers to walls, walls to gates, and gates to the central keep in a network that provided multiple routes between any 2 points in the castle. The final touch for each tower was the installation of its roof and weather protection systems, features that combined practical necessity with architectural beauty in the tradition of the finest medieval craftsmanship. Medieval builders had learned through centuries of experience that even the finest stone could be damaged by repeated freezing and thawing, so they crowned their towers with carefully designed drainage systems that would channel water away from vulnerable joints and surfaces. Lead gutters, slate tiles, and wooden shutters all played their part in protecting the stonework from the elements, while creating roof lines that enhanced rather than detracted from the tower's architectural impact. By the end of the 3rd year of construction, the castle's towers stood proud and complete against the sky, visible from many miles away across the surrounding countryside. Travelers approaching from any direction would see them first as distant points of light catching the sun, then gradually resolving into the magnificent structures they truly were, finally revealing themselves as masterpieces of medieval engineering and artistry that commanded both respect and admiration. Each tower told its own story, spoke of the dreams and skills of those who had raised it, stood as a testament to human ambition and craftsmanship that would endure for centuries to come. But even as the towers reached toward completion, work was already beginning on the next phase of the great project, the creation of the interior spaces that would make the castle not just a fortress, but a comfortable and beautiful home. For all the strength and beauty of stone and mortar, timber and iron, a castle was meaningless without the human life that would fill it. The families who would call it home, the communities that would flourish within its protecting walls. The towers were magnificent achievements in themselves, but they were only the beginning of the transformation that would turn this hilltop fortress into a living, breathing center of medieval life and culture. With the great towers reaching skyward like gentle stone guardians watching over the peaceful countryside, their crenellated tops catching the first light of dawn and the last golden rays of evening, the castle was beginning to reveal its true character to all who saw it rising from the ancient hillside. But the master builders and the lord who had dreamed this magnificent vision knew that their work was far from complete, for they had built the bones and sinews of their creation, the strong framework that would support everything to come, but not yet its heart and soul. Now came perhaps the most delicate and important phase of all, transforming the interior spaces from empty stone shells into warm, comfortable, beautiful rooms where families would live and love, where children would grow and learn, where the business of daily life would unfold in safety and comfort for generations to come. The Great Hall was always the first interior space to receive the builder's attention, for it was here that the castle would truly come alive with human activity and warmth. This magnificent chamber, often occupying the entire second floor of the keep or stretching across a substantial portion of the main residential building, would serve as dining room, reception hall, courtroom, and social center, all rolled into one impressive space. The floor was laid with carefully fitted stone slabs, each one selected for its beauty as well as its durability, ground smooth and polished until they gleamed like dark mirrors, capable of reflecting the dancing flames of torches and the colorful clothing of feast day celebrations. The process of creating the Great Hall's floor was a work of art in itself, requiring the combined skills of quarrymen, stone carvers, and master masons working in perfect harmony over many months. Each stone slab had to be cut to precise dimensions and fitted so perfectly with its neighbors that the joints between them were nearly invisible, creating a seamless surface that would remain level and beautiful for centuries of use. The stones were laid in carefully planned patterns that not only distributed weight evenly, but also created decorative designs that enhanced the beauty of the chamber without overwhelming its essential dignity and grandeur. The ceiling of the Great Hall was a masterpiece of medieval engineering and artistry combined, a structure that had to span enormous distances without any supporting columns that would interfere with the room's functionality. Great wooden beams, hewn from ancient oak trees that had grown slowly and straight for centuries, were carefully selected and shaped to create not just structural support, but architectural beauty. These massive timbers were carved with intricate patterns of vines and leaves, heraldic beasts, and geometric designs that seemed to dance in the changing light, stretching across the space like the ribs of some magnificent stone creature. The beams did more than simply hold up the floor above. They were designed to create perfect acoustics throughout the hall, so that a troubadour singing at one end of the chamber could be heard clearly by guests seated at the far end, while conversations at individual tables remained private and intimate. The master carpenters who shaped these beams understood the science of sound as well as the engineering of load-bearing structures, calculating curves and surfaces that would enhance rather than muffle the human voice. The walls of the Great Hall received special decorative treatment that transformed them from mere barriers into canvases for medieval artistry, for they would be seen by every important visitor to the castle and needed to reflect the Lord's sophistication and cultural refinement. Skilled craftsmen applied multiple layers of lime plaster, building up smooth surfaces that were as perfect as any modern wall, then allowed these surfaces to cure slowly until they provided ideal foundations for the elaborate artwork that would follow. The murals painted on these plastered walls were not merely decorative, but served as a kind of visual library, telling stories of great deeds and noble ancestry for guests who might not be able to read written words, but could certainly understand the language of pictures and symbols. These paintings depicted scenes from classical mythology, biblical stories that reinforced the family's Christian faith, and historical events that established the Lord's lineage and legitimacy. The artists who created these murals were among the most educated and cultured individuals of their time, men who could read Latin, who understood the symbolic language of heraldry, and who possessed the technical skills needed to create paintings that would remain bright and clear for centuries. At one end of the Great Hall, the builders constructed an enormous fireplace that served as both a practical necessity and the emotional heart of the entire castle. This fireplace was large enough for several people to stand inside its opening, designed to provide warmth for the entire hall, even during the coldest winter days, and built with such skill that it would draw properly without filling the room with smoke. The construction of such a fireplace required extraordinary understanding of combustion, airflow, and structural engineering, for it had to be integrated seamlessly into the wall while supporting the enormous weight of the masonry above it. The fireplace was not just a source of warmth, but the very heart of castle life, around which families would gather on cold winter evenings to share stories and songs, where important business would be conducted in comfortable privacy, and where the Lord would hold informal audiences with his vassals and retainers. The dancing flames created a hypnotic focus for conversation and contemplation, while the radiant heat made even the largest halls comfortable and welcoming during the darkest months of the year. The mantelpiece above the great fireplace was often the most elaborate piece of stonework in the entire castle, carved with the family's coat of arms, heraldic beasts that symbolized strength and nobility, and decorative motifs that proclaimed the Lord's status and allegiances to all who entered his hall. Master stone carvers would spend months on these masterpieces, using techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen, creating sculptures that seemed to bring mythical creatures to life in the dancing firelight. The level of detail in these carvings was extraordinary, with individual feathers on eagles, scales on dragons, and leaves on decorative vines, all carved with such precision that they seemed ready to move in the flickering shadows. Windows in the Great Hall presented unique challenges and opportunities for the builders, who needed to balance the desire for natural light with the requirements of security and weather protection. They needed to be large enough to fill the space with natural light during the day, creating a bright and cheerful atmosphere for daily activities, yet secure enough to resist attack if enemies ever managed to reach the castle walls. The solution was the development of elaborate window systems, with heavy wooden shutters that could be closed and barred from within, and stone tracery that divided large openings into smaller, more defensible sections, while creating beautiful patterns of light and shadow that changed throughout the day. The installation of these windows required the combined skills of masons, carpenters, and the rare and precious glaziers, working in perfect harmony to create openings that were both beautiful and functional. The stone framework had to be carved with mathematical precision, creating openings that would support the weight of the wall above, while providing maximum light transmission and visual appeal. The wooden shutters were crafted from seasoned oak that had been aged for years, until it was as hard and durable as iron, fitted with hand-forged hinges that would operate smoothly for decades, and secured with bars and locks that could withstand the impact of siege engines. For the wealthiest lords, these windows might even contain panels of precious glass, a luxury so rare and expensive that individual panes were often mentioned specifically in wills and inheritance documents, passed down through generations like family jewels. The glass itself was usually green or amber in color, thick and slightly uneven due to the limitations of medieval glassmaking techniques, casting a magical colored light into the hall that seemed to transform ordinary objects into things of wonder and beauty. Each pane was held in place with lead strips called cames that formed geometric patterns, creating windows that were both functional barriers against the weather and artistic masterpieces that enhanced the beauty of the interior spaces. Adjacent to the Great Hall, the builders created a network of smaller chambers, each designed for specific purposes in the complex daily life of a medieval castle, each contributing to the overall functionality and comfort of the fortress home. The solar, or private sitting room of the lord and lady, was typically located on the same level as the Great Hall, but separated from it by thick walls and heavy doors that provided privacy and quiet for intimate family gatherings and important private conversations. This chamber received the finest decorative treatment of all the castle's rooms, with painted walls that might depict scenes from courtly romances, comfortable window seats equipped with cushions and small tables for reading and needlework, and sometimes even the incredible luxury of wooden floors laid over the stone, creating a warmer and more intimate atmosphere that contrasted beautifully with the grand formality of the Great Hall. The solar was where the lord and lady would retreat when they needed respite from the public duties of their position, where they could enjoy quiet conversations, play chess or other games, and simply relax in comfortable privacy. The kitchens were perhaps the most complex spaces in the entire castle from an engineering perspective, for they had to safely contain and control enormous fires while preventing the entire structure from burning down around them. The main kitchen was usually located in a separate building or in a specially designed wing of the castle with extra thick fire walls, connected to the Great Hall by covered passages that would keep food warm during transport while protecting servants from weather during their constant journeys between cooking and serving areas. The massive cooking fireplaces in these kitchens were marvels of medieval technology that combined practical functionality with impressive scale, featuring adjustable hooks and chains for suspending pots at different heights above the flames, rotating spits for roasting large pieces of meat, and specialized ovens for baking bread and pastries. These fireplaces were designed with careful attention to airflow and heat distribution, ensuring that different cooking tasks could be carried out simultaneously at different temperature zones within the same fire system. The construction of kitchen chimneys required special expertise and knowledge, for they had to draw smoke and heat efficiently while preventing sparks from escaping to ignite wooden roofs or other flammable materials throughout the castle. These chimneys were often among the tallest structures in the entire fortress, visible from great distances as they carried the aromatic smoke of roasting meats and baking bread high into the sky, like fragrant signals of prosperity and hospitality. The sight and smell of kitchen smoke became one of the most welcoming signs that a castle was inhabited and thriving, a signal to travelers that they might find food and shelter within those strong walls. Storage spaces throughout the castle were designed with the understanding that self-sufficiency was essential for survival, particularly during times of siege, when the castle might be cut off from outside supplies for months at a time. Great stone-lined chambers were built for storing grain, their walls designed to keep out moisture and rodents, while maintaining the constant cool temperatures that would preserve food for months or even years without spoilage. These storage rooms were often equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems that prevented the buildup of harmful gases while keeping the stored grain dry and fresh. Wine cellars were excavated deep into the hill itself, taking advantage of the natural temperature stability of the earth to create perfect conditions for aging the barrels of wine and ale that were essential to medieval hospitality and daily life. These underground chambers were lined with carefully fitted stones and equipped with drainage systems that would prevent flooding during heavy rains, while their arched ceilings distributed the weight of the structure above without requiring interior supports that would interfere with the storage of large barrels. The castle chapel was always one of the most beautiful and carefully crafted spaces, for it served not only the spiritual needs of the castle's residents, but also as a symbol of the Lord's piety and status in a deeply religious age. Even in the smallest castles, the chapel received elaborate attention from the finest craftsmen, with carved stone altars that were works of sculpture, painted religious scenes on the walls that rivaled the finest illuminated manuscripts, and windows positioned to cast the most beautiful light during morning prayers and evening vespers. The acoustics of these small chambers were carefully designed so that prayers and hymns would resonate with perfect clarity, creating an atmosphere of reverence and beauty that enhanced the spiritual experience of worship. The master masons understood that sound behaved differently in different types of spaces, and they shaped the chapel's walls and ceiling to create the optimal acoustic environment for both spoken prayers and sung liturgy. As the interior work progressed through the 4th and 5th years of construction, attention turned to the creation of comfortable living spaces for the castle's residents and the many guests who would visit throughout the years. Bedchambers were carved from the thick walls of the towers, each with its own fireplace for warmth during cold nights, and windows positioned to provide light for reading and needlework during the day. These rooms were often quite small by modern standards, but they were designed to be cozy and secure, with thick tapestries covering the walls to provide both insulation and beauty, and built-in storage areas that made efficient use of every available space. The garderobe, or medieval bathroom, was an ingenious solution to sanitation challenges that would not be matched for cleanliness and efficiency until much later in history. These small chambers were built into the thickness of exterior walls, with carefully angled chutes that carried waste safely away from the living areas and into pits or streams below the castle. The positioning of garderobes was planned during the earliest stages of construction, ensuring that they would function properly while maintaining the dignity and comfort of the castle's inhabitants and never creating health hazards within the living areas. Water systems within the castle required extraordinary ingenuity and planning, for a reliable supply of fresh water was even more important than food for the survival of the castle's inhabitants. Wells were often dug directly through the floors of interior courtyards, their stone-lined shafts descending deep into the earth to reach reliable water sources that would continue flowing even during the driest summers or the longest sieges. These wells were not just functional necessities, but often became decorative focal points, with elaborate stone curbing carved with heraldic symbols and sometimes even small roof structures to protect the water from contamination and to create gathering places where people could meet and socialize while drawing water for daily from all use. For castles built near rivers or streams, the builders sometimes created elaborate systems of channels and cisterns that brought fresh water directly into the heart of the structure, through ingenious networks of stone conduits and settling basins. These systems required the skills of hydraulic engineers who understood how to maintain proper water pressure and flow rates over long distances and significant changes in elevation, creating miniature aqueducts that rivaled the engineering achievements of ancient Rome. The sound of running water in hidden channels became part of the castle's voice, a gentle murmur that spoke of prosperity and careful planning, audible to inhabitants as a constant reminder of their security and comfort. The courtyards within the castle walls were designed as outdoor living spaces, gardens where families could enjoy fresh air and sunshine in complete safety while remaining within the protection of the fortress walls. These spaces were carefully planned with sophisticated drainage systems that would prevent flooding during heavy rains, while herb gardens and small orchards provided both practical supplies for the kitchen and beautiful spaces for quiet contemplation and gentle recreation. The courtyards also served important practical purposes, providing space for craftsmen's workshops, storage areas for materials and equipment, and exercise grounds where the castle's garrison could practice their military skills and maintain their physical fitness. The planning of courtyard spaces required careful consideration of how people would use them throughout the day and across the changing seasons. Areas needed to be designated for different activities, spaces where children could play safely, areas where servants could work without interfering with the Lord's family, gardens where ladies could walk and enjoy flowers and herbs, and practical zones where horses could be exercised and equipment could be maintained. The master planners arranged these areas so that they complemented rather than conflicted with each other, creating a harmonious outdoor environment that enhanced the quality of life for everyone within the castle walls. Staircases throughout the castle were works of art as well as functional necessities, demonstrating the medieval builders' understanding that every element of their creation should be both beautiful and practical. Each step was carved from solid stone, shaped and finished until it was as smooth as silk to the touch, and designed with risers and treads that would be comfortable for people wearing the long robes and pointed shoes that were fashionable in medieval times. The curves of spiral staircases were calculated not just for structural strength and defensive advantage, but to create graceful ascending passages that enhanced the experience of moving through the castle and added to its overall architectural beauty. The handrails and balustrades that accompanied these staircases were often carved with elaborate, decorative motifs that transformed practical safety features into artistic elements. Stone carvers would spend weeks creating flowing patterns of leaves and vines, heraldic symbols, and geometric designs that provided both practical grip for ascending and descending users and visual pleasure for anyone who paused to admire the craftsmanship. Lighting systems within the castle required careful planning and sophisticated engineering, for medieval nights were truly dark in ways that modern people, accustomed to electric illumination, can barely imagine. Stone brackets for torches were carved directly into the walls at regular intervals, positioned to provide maximum illumination while minimizing fire hazards and smoke accumulation in enclosed spaces. These brackets were not simple functional fixtures, but were often decorated with carved details that made them attractive even when not in use, and they were positioned with careful attention to traffic patterns and the specific lighting needs of different areas. Candle niches, small arched recesses carved into the walls, allowed for safer lighting in bedchambers and other sensitive areas where open flames might be dangerous to tapestries, wooden furniture, or sleeping occupants. These niches were designed with careful attention to ventilation, ensuring that candle smoke would be drawn away from living spaces, and they were often equipped with metal reflectors that maximized the light output of precious candles while protecting the stone walls from heat damage. The great iron hinges and locks that secured the castle's doors were marvels of medieval craftsmanship, created by blacksmiths who understood that security and beauty could be combined in functional objects that would be seen and used every day. These massive hinges, some weighing hundreds of pounds and measuring several feet in length, were not just strong enough to support heavy oak doors that might weigh as much as small trees, but were often decorated with intricate patterns that transformed utilitarian hardware into works of art. The ironwork was sometimes gilded or painted in bright colors that complemented the overall decorative scheme of each room, creating a unified aesthetic that extended even to the most practical elements of the castle's construction. The locks themselves were complex mechanisms that only their makers truly understood, mechanical puzzles that required specially designed keys to operate, keys that were themselves treasured possessions, passed down through generations as symbols of authority and trust. Some of the most elaborate locks featured multiple tumblers and false mechanisms designed to confuse anyone who might attempt to pick them, while the keys might be decorated with the same heraldic symbols that appeared elsewhere in the castle's decoration. As the interior work neared completion during the 5th and 6th years of construction, the castle began to feel like a living organism rather than just an impressive building, a place where human life could flourish in comfort and security. Each room had its own character and purpose. Each passage told part of the larger story of how people would live and move within these walls, and the entire structure worked together as a unified system designed to serve the needs of its inhabitants. The sound of footsteps on stone stairs, the whisper of drafts through carefully planned ventilation systems, the play of light and shadow through windows and doorways, all of these elements combined to create a building that was truly alive with human presence and activity. Private chambers were fitted out with every comfort that medieval technology could provide, from built-in wardrobes carved into the thickness of the walls to ingenious heating systems that used the warm air from fireplaces to heat multiple rooms through carefully designed ducts and vents. Some chambers featured private bathrooms with running water supplied by the castle's sophisticated plumbing systems, while others included private oratories where family members could pray in solitude and contemplation. The furnishing of these chambers required the services of master craftsmen in wood, metal, and textile, for medieval furniture was built to last for generations and was often considered as valuable as land or livestock. Great oak chests, bound with iron, served as both storage and seating, while carved beds with elaborate hangings provided privacy and warmth during cold nights. Tapestries woven with silk and gold thread covered the walls, depicting scenes from romance and legend, while providing practical insulation that made the stone chambers comfortable year-round. By the 6th year of construction, visitors entering the castle would find themselves in a world that was both magnificent and comfortable, both imposing and welcoming, a place where every practical need had been anticipated and every aesthetic desire satisfied. The transformation from empty hilltop to functioning fortress home was nearly complete, but the most crucial element was still to come: the systems and strategies that would allow this beautiful creation to defend itself and its inhabitants against any who might wish them harm. For a castle without proper defenses was merely a very expensive house, vulnerable to any organized attack and unable to fulfill its primary purpose of providing security for those who sheltered within its walls. The final phase of interior construction involved the installation of all the mechanical systems that would make the castle truly functional: pulleys and winches for raising heavy loads, drainage systems for channeling rainwater away from vulnerable areas, and the complex mechanisms that operated gates, drawbridges, and other defensive features. These systems were hidden within the walls and floors of the castle, invisible to casual observers but essential for the daily operation of the fortress. As our beautiful castle stood nearly complete against the peaceful countryside, its towers reaching toward the clouds and its walls glowing warmly in the golden light of another sunset, it might have seemed to casual observers that the work was finished, that the dream had been fully realized in stone and timber, mortar and iron. But the master builders and the Lord who had envisioned this magnificent structure understood a deeper truth, that true security came not just from thick walls and high towers, impressive though these certainly were, but from a careful understanding of how those walls and towers could work together to protect all who sheltered within them. The art of castle defense was like a gentle dance performed on a grand scale, where every movement had meaning, where every element supported every other element in perfect harmony, creating a system of protection that was greater than the sum of its individual parts. The outermost ring of defense began far from the castle itself, extending miles into the surrounding countryside, where the Lord's foresters and huntsmen served as the eyes and ears of the fortress, maintaining a network of observation and communication that would provide early warning of any approaching danger. These men knew every path through the nearby woods, like children know the rooms of their own homes, every ford across the streams, every hiding place where enemies might attempt to conceal themselves, every vantage point from which the castle's approaches could be observed. They moved through the landscape like shadows given human form, watching and listening with senses sharpened by years of practice, always ready to carry word back to the castle if strangers appeared in the area, or if anything seemed unusual or potentially threatening. Their knowledge of the terrain was so complete that they could travel at night without torches or other illumination, guided by the feel of familiar paths beneath their feet, the sounds of known streams, and wind through recognized trees, and an almost supernatural awareness of the landscape that came from spending their entire lives within its boundaries. They knew which routes offered the best concealment for friendly messengers, which paths would be most difficult for enemy forces to negotiate with heavy equipment, and where natural obstacles could be enhanced with simple engineering to create impassable barriers. These forest watchers maintained a sophisticated communication system that could relay messages across dozens of miles in a matter of hours, using horn calls, smoke signals, and relay stations hidden in hollow trees or concealed shelters. During times of heightened tension, they would establish observation posts on hilltops and in tall trees, creating a network of overlapping surveillance that made it virtually impossible for any significant force to approach the castle undetected. Closer to the castle itself, the defensive strategy began with the landscape itself, carefully shaped and modified over years of patient work to make any approach as difficult and exposed as possible while maintaining the natural beauty that made the castle an appealing home. Trees that might provide cover for attackers had been selectively cleared away, creating open fields where any approaching force would be visible from the castle walls, while still hundreds of yards away. Yet the clearing was done so skillfully that the landscape appeared natural and unaltered to casual observation. These cleared areas, known to military engineers as killing fields, were not barren wastelands, but carefully maintained meadows that provided grazing for the castle's horses and cattle during peaceful times, while also serving as execution grounds for the castle's defensive systems when danger threatened. The fields were subtly graded to channel attacking forces toward predetermined zones where the castle's defenses were most effective, while creating hidden obstacles and difficulties that would slow and disorganize any assault. The water defenses were among the most effective and elegant elements of castle protection, combining practical military necessity with aesthetic beauty in ways that enhanced rather than detracted from the fortress's appearance. Where natural water barriers did not exist, the builders had created them through massive engineering projects, diverting streams and building dams to create artificial lakes and marshes that would bog down attacking forces and their heavy equipment, while providing additional sources of fresh water and fish for the castle's inhabitants. These water obstacles served multiple purposes beyond simple military defense, for they not only impeded enemies, but also provided reservoirs of fresh water for use during sieges, power for mills that ground grain and performed other essential tasks, and even recreational opportunities for the castle's inhabitants during peaceful times. The artificial lakes were often stocked with fish, creating sustainable food sources that required no external inputs, while the marshes attracted waterfowl that provided additional protein for the castle's kitchens. The famous castle moat, filled with water where possible and engineered with sophisticated drainage systems where water was not available, was far more than a simple ditch around the walls. The medieval engineers who designed these obstacles understood that an effective moat had to be wide enough that siege ladders could not span it, deep enough that it could not be easily filled with earth or fascines, and connected to reliable water sources that would keep it full even during long sieges when enemies might attempt to drain or divert the water supply. The sides of water-filled moats were often lined with carefully fitted stones that prevented erosion while making it nearly impossible for attackers to climb out once they had fallen in, either accidentally or while attempting to wade across under fire from the castle's defenders. The bottom of the moat might be studded with sharpened stakes or caltrops, iron devices designed to wound or disable anyone who attempted to cross the obstacle, while the water itself was sometimes connected to the castle's sewage systems, making it not just an obstacle but a genuinely unpleasant place to spend time. Where water was not available for filling moats, the builders created dry moats that were equally effective obstacles, deep ditches lined with sharpened stakes or studded with iron spikes that would impale anyone unlucky enough to fall into them. These dry moats were often designed with false floors, thin layers of branches and earth that would support the weight of a single scout but collapse under the weight of an armed group, dropping attackers into the spiked pit below, where they would be helpless and exposed to fire from the castle walls. The approach to the main gate was never direct, but followed a carefully planned route that exposed attacking forces to defensive fire from multiple directions, while preventing them from using their full strength against any single point of the castle's defenses. The road might wind back and forth across the outer defenses like a snake, cross the moat on a drawbridge that could be destroyed at a moment's notice, then turn sharply just before reaching the gate itself to prevent the use of battering rams and other siege engines. Every turn in this approach was calculated to slow down attackers while speeding up the defenders' response, creating a killing ground where the castle's advantages would be maximized. The drawbridge mechanism was itself a masterpiece of medieval engineering, a massive structure that could be raised and lowered by a relatively small number of operators working the great windlasses housed in specially designed chambers within the gatehouse towers. When raised, the drawbridge did not simply block the entrance, it became part of the gate's defenses, a thick wooden and iron shield that could withstand the impact of battering rams and siege engines while providing additional protection for the gates behind it. The chains and counterweights that operated the drawbridge were protected within the gatehouse structure itself, safe from enemy interference and accessible only to the castle's defenders. Beyond the drawbridge lay the barbican, an outer gatehouse that served as the first real test of any attacker's determination and capability, a structure designed to separate casual visitors from serious threats while providing defenders with multiple opportunities to evaluate and respond to approaching forces. This structure was designed to channel approaching forces into a narrow passage where they could be observed, questioned, and if necessary, engaged by defenders who held every possible advantage in terms of position, protection, and fields of fire. The barbican's walls were lined with arrow loops and murder holes, openings through which defenders could shoot arrows or crossbow bolts, or pour various unpleasant substances on unwelcome visitors who refused to retreat when challenged. The main gatehouse itself was perhaps the most complex defensive structure in the entire castle, a fortress within a fortress that incorporated multiple layers of protection and multiple fallback positions for defenders, even if the outer defenses were overcome. The great wooden gates, constructed from seasoned oak timbers bound with iron bands and reinforced with metal studs that could deflect arrows and other projectiles, were hung on hinges so massive that they required teams of men to operate properly. But even if attackers managed to break through these formidable gates, they would find themselves trapped in a killing corridor, a narrow passage completely dominated by murder holes in the ceiling and arrow slits in the walls, with no escape route and no protection from the defenders' weapons. The portcullis, that fearsome iron grating that could be lowered to block the gateway like a giant's cage, was more than just a simple barrier to be overcome by brute force. Its iron spikes were designed to penetrate deeply into grooves cut into the stone threshold, creating a seal that was virtually impossible to break from the outside, even with the heaviest siege equipment. The mechanism that operated the portcullis was housed high in the gatehouse tower, accessible only to the castle's defenders through secure passages and protected by multiple layers of security, including additional gates, barriers, and defensive positions. But perhaps the most ingenious element of gatehouse defense was the bent entrance, a passage that turned sharply at least once, and often several times, between the outer and inner gates. This design prevented attackers from using battering rams effectively, since they could not build up sufficient momentum in the confined space to deliver effective blows against the inner barriers. It also meant that anyone who managed to break through the first gate would find themselves in an enclosed courtyard completely dominated by defensive positions, with nowhere to retreat and little room to maneuver their weapons or equipment effectively. The walls themselves were designed with subtle but crucial defensive features that were not immediately apparent to casual observers, but made enormous differences in the castle's ability to resist attack. The outer faces of the walls were not perfectly vertical, but sloped slightly outward at the base in a design feature called a batter that served multiple important purposes in the overall defensive strategy. This slope made the walls stronger by distributing weight more effectively throughout the foundation. It caused dropped stones and other missiles to bounce outward into attacking forces rather than falling harmlessly at the base of the wall, and it made it virtually impossible to place scaling ladders securely against the wall surface. Arrow loops, those narrow vertical slits in the castle walls that seemed almost decorative to peaceful observers, were actually marvels of military architecture that allowed defenders to shoot out while remaining almost completely protected from return fire. Each loop was carefully designed with a wide interior opening that gave the archer room to maneuver his bow and select his targets, tapering to a narrow exterior slit that presented the smallest possible target to enemy archers while still allowing for accurate shooting. The height and angle of each loop were calculated to provide overlapping fields of fire that left no approach to the castle uncovered, creating zones of defensive coverage that interlocked like the scales of a dragon's hide. The interior chambers behind each arrow loop were designed as complete fighting positions, equipped with storage for arrows and other weapons, seating for archers during long watches, and ventilation systems that would prevent the buildup of smoke from fires or the stuffiness that might impair the defenders' effectiveness. Some of these chambers featured mechanical devices that could launch multiple arrows simultaneously, early forms of artillery that multiplied the effectiveness of individual defenders. The battlements that crowned the castle walls were not merely decorative features copied from other buildings, but carefully engineered fighting platforms that provided defenders with both protection and mobility, while creating architectural elements that enhanced the castle's visual impact. The merlons, or raised portions, were thick enough to stop arrows and crossbow bolts while providing secure positions from which archers could operate without fear of enemy retaliation. The crenels, or gaps between merlons, were sized to allow easy shooting while being too narrow to provide good targets for enemy missiles, and they were often equipped with wooden shutters that could be closed to provide additional protection when needed. Behind the battlements, the wall walk provided a secure platform where defenders could move quickly from one position to another, carrying messages, redistributing ammunition, or reinforcing threatened sections of the defenses. These walkways were protected by the battlements on the outer side and by the roofs of interior buildings on the inner side, creating secure corridors that allowed the castle's garrison to respond quickly and effectively to threats developing anywhere along the perimeter. The towers that rose at intervals along the walls served multiple defensive functions beyond their obvious role as elevated fighting positions that dominated the surrounding countryside. Their projection beyond the wall line allowed defenders to provide flanking fire along the entire length of the curtain walls, ensuring that no section was left undefended and that enemies could not approach the walls without being exposed to crossfire from multiple directions. The towers also served as secure strongpoints that could continue to resist even if sections of the wall between them were breached or captured, creating multiple independent defensive positions that would have to be overcome one by one. Within each tower, the spiral staircases were designed with defense in mind, always spiraling clockwise as one ascended in accordance with ancient military wisdom that had been tested in countless battles over the centuries. This seemingly simple design choice gave defending swordsmen, who were usually right-handed like most people, a significant advantage over attacking right-handed swordsmen, whose sword arms would be restricted by the central column of the staircase, while the defenders enjoyed complete freedom of movement. Every step, every turn, every doorway in the castle was planned to give defenders an edge over any attacker who managed to penetrate the outer defenses, creating a three-dimensional maze that favored those who knew its secrets. The doorways within the towers were positioned and designed with careful attention to defensive requirements, often featuring heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands, secured with multiple locks and bars, and positioned so that defenders could control access to different levels of the tower independently. Many doors were designed to open inward, so that attackers could not use battering rams effectively in the confined spaces of the staircases, while secret passages allowed defenders to bypass compromised areas and attack enemies from unexpected directions. The great keep at the center of the castle was the ultimate defensive position, designed to hold out against any assault, even if all the outer defenses were overcome by superior numbers or treachery. Its walls were thickest at the base, sometimes 20 feet thick or more, making it virtually impossible to breach with medieval siege equipment, even after months of concentrated bombardment. The entrance to the keep was often on the second floor, accessible only by a removable wooden staircase that could be destroyed in moments to deny access to attackers, forcing them to attempt the nearly impossible task of scaling smooth stone walls under fire from the defenders above. Inside the keep, every floor was designed to be defensible independently, with narrow staircases that could be blocked with heavy furniture or collapsed entirely if necessary. and provisions stored on multiple levels so that defenders could hold out for weeks or months, even if the lower levels of the tower were captured. The well within the keep ensured a reliable water supply even during the longest siege, while carefully designed ventilation systems prevented the buildup of smoke from cooking fires that might otherwise reveal the defenders' positions or make the interior chambers uninhabitable. The keep's defensive systems included a variety of ingenious features that casual visitors would never suspect, hidden mechanisms and secret passages that gave defenders multiple options for responding to different types of threats. Secret doors led to escape tunnels that could allow the Lord's family to flee if the situation became hopeless, while hidden chambers provided secure storage for the most precious treasures and documents that defined the family's heritage and legal rights. The castle's garrison, the permanent military force that manned its defenses during both peaceful and dangerous times, was organized with the same attention to detail and systematic planning that characterized the physical fortifications themselves. Each man knew his specific role and position during different types of emergencies, could find his way to his assigned post in complete darkness, using tactile landmarks and memorized routes, and understood how his individual efforts contributed to the overall defensive strategy that protected the entire castle community. Regular drills ensured that the entire defensive system could be activated quickly and efficiently at any time of day or night, with responses practiced until they became automatic reflexes that would function properly even under the stress and confusion of actual combat. These exercises were conducted like elaborate dances, with each participant knowing exactly when and where to move, which equipment to gather, and which positions to occupy in response to different alarm signals. The training of the garrison went far beyond simple military skills, encompassing the maintenance and operation of all the castle's defensive systems, from the great siege engines mounted on the towers to the complex mechanisms that operated gates and drawbridges. Each soldier was cross-trained in multiple specialties so that the loss of any individual would not compromise the castle's ability to defend itself effectively. They learned to operate in the darkness that would prevail during night attacks, to coordinate their efforts through horn calls and other signals that could penetrate the noise of battle, and to maintain their equipment in perfect working order through years of peaceful routine. Communication systems within the castle allowed defenders to coordinate their efforts even during the chaos and confusion of an actual attack, with horn calls, bell signals, and flag systems providing ways to relay information quickly across the entire fortification. These communication networks were designed with multiple redundancies so that if one system failed or was disrupted by enemy action, alternative methods would remain available to maintain coordination among the defenders. Pre-positioned supplies of arrows, crossbow bolts, stones for throwing, and other defensive materials were stored at strategic points throughout the castle, ensuring that no fighting position would run out of ammunition during a prolonged battle. These supply caches were carefully inventoried and maintained, with regular inspections to ensure that weapons remained sharp, bowstrings stayed dry and supple, and that quantities were sufficient for extended combat operations. The castle's defensive arsenal included a variety of specialized weapons and equipment designed specifically for fortress warfare, tools that were useless in open battle but devastatingly effective when used from the protection of stone walls and towers. Great crossbows mounted on wooden frames could shoot bolts powerful enough to penetrate armor at distances that would have been impossible with handheld weapons, while catapults and other siege engines could launch stones and other projectiles far beyond the range of individual soldiers. But perhaps the most important element of castle defense was not physical at all, but psychological, the effect that the very appearance of the castle had on potential enemies who might consider attacking it. The sight of massive walls rising seamlessly from their foundations, of towers that seemed to scrape the clouds themselves, of gates that appeared capable of withstanding any assault, sent a clear message to anyone who might harbor hostile intentions. Most conflicts in medieval times were resolved without siege or battle, simply because the sight of a well-designed and properly defended castle convinced potential attackers to seek easier targets elsewhere, to negotiate rather than fight, or to abandon their aggressive plans entirely. The psychological impact of the castle was enhanced by careful attention to its visual presentation, with banners and flags flying from the towers, guards visible on the battlements, and smoke rising from the chimneys to indicate that the fortress was fully manned and ready for any challenge. The very sound of daily life within the castle, the ring of hammers from the blacksmith's shop, the calls of guards changing shifts, the bustle of servants going about their duties, served to remind potential enemies that they would be facing not just stone walls, but a living, organized community prepared to defend itself. The daily routine within the castle maintained defensive readiness even during the most peaceful times, with procedures and protocols that kept the fortress in a constant state of quiet alertness. Gates were closed and barred each night at sunset according to strict schedules. Guards walked their rounds at regular intervals throughout the night and day, and weapons were kept clean, sharp, and ready for immediate use at all times. These routines, practiced day after day, year after year, ensured that when danger did threaten, the castle's defenses would operate smoothly and effectively without the confusion and delays that might prove fatal in a real emergency. The castle's defensive strategy included provisions for different types of threats, from small raiding parties that might attempt to steal livestock or supplies, to major siege armies that could invest the fortress for months at a time. Against raiders, the emphasis was on early detection and rapid response, using the mobility advantages that the castle's height and defensive positions provided to drive off attackers before they could accomplish their goals. Against larger forces, the strategy shifted to passive resistance, making the castle so difficult and expensive to capture that enemies would eventually abandon their efforts and seek easier targets elsewhere. The provisioning systems that supported these defensive strategies were as carefully planned as the military aspects themselves, with enormous storage facilities that could maintain the castle's population for extended periods without outside supplies. Granaries held enough wheat and other grains to feed hundreds of people for months, while salt stores preserved meat and fish that could last through the longest winter or the most extended siege. Weapon and ammunition stores ensured that defenders would never run short of the tools they needed to protect themselves, while medical supplies and equipment allowed the castle's physicians to treat injuries and illnesses without depending on outside assistance. The integration of all these defensive elements created a fortress that was far more than the sum of its individual parts, a living system that could adapt and respond to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential mission of protecting those who sheltered within its walls. The walls that seemed so beautiful in the morning sunlight were also supremely functional barriers against aggression. The towers that appeared so graceful and elegant were also perfectly positioned for maximum defensive effectiveness, and the gates that opened so welcomingly to friends could close just as decisively against enemies. As our peaceful castle settled into the rhythm of daily life, with children playing safely in the courtyards and merchants arriving regularly at the gates, its defensive systems remained quietly ready, like a great creature sleeping but alert to danger. The guards on their rounds, the weapons in their racks, the mechanisms that operated gates and portcullises, all stood ready to spring into action at a moment's notice, while the castle's inhabitants went about their daily lives in the secure knowledge that they were protected by some of the finest defensive engineering that human ingenuity had ever devised. The castle's reputation for impregnability spread throughout the surrounding region and beyond, carried by travelers who had seen its impressive defenses, by merchants who had observed its efficient operations, and by potential enemies who had reconnoitered its approaches and decided that attacking such a fortress would be too costly and dangerous to attempt. This reputation became one of the castle's most effective defenses, for it prevented many conflicts from developing in the first place, allowing the inhabitants to live in peace while knowing that their security was guaranteed by both stone walls and the fearsome reputation of those walls. And in this perfect balance between beauty and strength, between welcome and warning, between the peaceful life within and the dangerous world beyond, we see the true genius of medieval castle design and defensive strategy. These magnificent structures were not just fortresses or just homes, but something far more wonderful. They were dreams made real in stone and timber, dreams of safety and prosperity, of strength and beauty, of communities that could flourish and families that could grow in peace and security under the protection of walls that embodied the highest achievements of human engineering and artistry. The gentle art of castle building had created not just buildings, but sanctuaries where the best of human life could unfold under the protection of walls that would stand strong for centuries to come. The legacy of these defensive innovations extended far beyond the individual castles where they were first implemented, influencing military architecture throughout Europe and beyond for centuries to come. The techniques developed by medieval castle builders would be refined and adapted for new weapons and new tactics, but the fundamental principles they established, the integration of beauty with functionality, the coordination of multiple defensive systems, the importance of psychological as well as physical deterrence, would remain relevant as long as humans needed to protect themselves and their communities from those who would do them harm. As the sun sets once more over our completed castle, casting long shadows across the peaceful countryside and painting the stone walls with warm golden light, we can imagine the satisfaction of all those who contributed to its creation, from the Lord who first dreamed of this place to the humblest laborer who carried stones up the hillside. Together, they created something magnificent and lasting, a testament to human skill and vision that would shelter and protect families for generations yet to be born, standing as proof that dreams, when pursued with patience and skill, can indeed become reality in stone and mortar. In the growing dusk, lights begin to twinkle in the castle windows, warm and welcoming beacons that speak of safety and comfort, while the strong walls stand ready to guard the dreams of all who sleep safely within. protected by some of the finest defensive architecture that human civilization has ever created. And so our gentle tale of medieval castle construction and defense comes to its peaceful close, with stone dreams fully realized, defensive arts perfected and proven, and a magnificent fortress home standing proud and secure against the starlit sky, ready for whatever adventures the future might bring to its fortunate inhabitants. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of castles strong and beautiful, where safety and wonder dance together in the ancient rhythm of stone and stars, where human ingenuity and artistic vision combine to create sanctuaries that would endure through the centuries, protecting and inspiring all who were blessed to call them home. May your own dreams be as solid as castle foundations, as beautiful as carved stone, and as enduring as the towers that still stand today, silent witnesses to the skill and vision of the master builders who raised them so long ago.